C.S. Malerich is an author of fantastic fiction, a library worker, a member of the National Writers Union and AFSCME Local 3001, and a longtime vegan. Among her published works are numerous pieces of short fiction and the novel Fire and Locket. C.S. Malerich joined me to discuss her new historical fantasy novella, The Factory Witches of Lowell, which tells the story of a group of women working at the mills during the heyday of textile production who stage a strike. Their labor action is backed both by earthly powers like the newly formed Factory Girls Union and by the witchcraft of Hannah, a seer who is in touch with supernatural forces and is one of, though certainly not the only, titular Factory Witches of Lowell. My first question is about the origin of this story. Were you interested in just telling a story about a labor action or worker solidarity, and Lowell presented itself as an outlet for that, considering its history? Or were you specifically looking to do something that married supernatural fiction with mill towns in New England in the Industrial Revolution?
It's definitely more the first than the second. I am a writer who gets excited by a concept or an idea before I ever have an idea of the characters or the plot. So I had this thought in my head of this magic system that was based on the relationships between workers, machinery, and their bosses. And I was actually trying to write a modern day set urban fantasy that was working with those themes. And I wanted labor organizers in the book. And as I was working on that, kind of my concept for the world had this alternative history of what labor organizing had been in the past, pulling on these supernatural forces. So, and things often do in the writer world, like a confluence of things happened at once. But one was I saw a call for an anthology called Hidden Youth that would explore stories from underrepresented groups. And they specifically said that they wanted to see working class stories. And so I thought, let me try, while I'm working out this idea of what this world is in my novel and this magic system, let me try to write a story that takes place in the same universe, but earlier. And then I was trying to think like, well, what's the labor action? Like, who are these characters? Where are they going to be working? What's the appropriate time frame? And I had also recently listened to voices from Howard Zinn's People's History of America. And one of the featured voices was Harriet Hansen, who she describes how at the age of 11, she was working in the mills, and some of the workers were ready to go out on strike and some of the workers were not. And she got up and declared to everyone who was around her that she was going to go out on strike, and called them all cowards if they didn't go with her. So I had that in my head and I had remembered that. So I started looking into what is the history of Lowell. Who is this young girl? Who are these workers that were organizing at that time? And then it became very clear to me that the history of Lowell and the life of the mill girls was very well documented. Lowell is actually a place that I could get to, that there was a historic park and I could walk into one of the factories. I could walk into one of the boarding houses and see it for myself. So that made it all really attractive as a place where I could set a story like the one that I wanted to tell.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about the research process for this. So you came to Lowell, you came to the national park. What was the research process for this like, getting to know, both the area here and the mill area, but researching the time period and diving deep into what it was like for factory workers at the time?
So I started by tracking down the source for that little piece of Harriet Hansen's memoir. So she actually wrote a whole memoir about her time in the mills called Lumen Spindle, and I was able to track that down. I found a really wonderful history in my local library by William Moran called The Bells of New England that looks at the Industrial Revolution in New England and specifically how young women became, for the first time, really like a large part of the labor force, and how they were organizing themselves even in a fairly early period in the 1830s. So I kind of started from those two texts, and then I went from there looking for the information that I needed. I had actually written a full draft of the story before I came to Lowell. And in some ways, walking around and visiting the structures that exist, that survive, was more like confirming what I had imagined already. And I know I tweaked a few things, but a lot of it was already really alive for me in the texts that I had found in the histories. So that's how I did it. I'm not a historian at all, but when I write, I tend to do a lot of research, and I tend to pick things that I'm going to be excited about researching. So it was a lot of fun.
And the novel does feature pretty prominently Kirk Boot, who is a real historical figure.
Yeah, I mean, I found it really interesting that he had actually planned the city after his time in England, and he, like a lot of the owners of the early mills, had the concept that they wanted to make this a better life for their workers than what they were seeing in England. So the boarding house system, for example, was designed to be at what they thought was a more humane way of treating their young female workers, so that they would be cared for and taken care of, and didn't have to leave the factory at the end of the day and find some like awful garret to go home and sleep in. And I think in some ways, like, that was quite important, because I wanted my antagonist to not be a straw man. I wanted someone who actually, thought in a lot of ways that he was doing the right thing, and then was just happened to be taken by surprise by how much more these young women were demanding for themselves, and how much more, almost dignity they were asking for in terms of determining their own lives.
Without getting too much into I want this interview to be fairly spoiler free, but the girls do stage a strike. The factory is shut down for a little while, and one of the arguments that Boot makes in the book is, if industry can't function unimpeded, basically America will fail. This is at the time still a fairly new country, and his basic argument is that the backbone of that country is the unimpeded functioning of these large companies and large sort of capitalist machines, which is interesting to read in light of some of the arguments that have been lodged recently about opening, quote unquote, the economy, and the connection between national strength and corporate strength. Was that in your mind at all with Boot as a character?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely got that feeling as I was doing my research, that this was looked at as part of the national project, that we have to make the United States a great country that can stand toe to toe with England or some of the other European powers. And there definitely was an appeal that worked on some level to these young women, that you are now part of creating this nation. And if you're not going to go along with what your bosses are telling you need to do, then in some ways you're betraying your country, you're betraying the spirit of the American Revolution. And you're betraying this like very independence that you're saying that you want, and you're trying to claim in this very individualistic way. even though I don't tend to view it as an individualistic enterprise to be a labor organizer.
And were there any other stories or authors or generic traditions that you felt that you were drawing on? Obviously, I was thinking about the fact that there's a rich tradition of witch stories set here in New England, although primarily those aren't set during the Industrial Revolution when your book is. But were there specific authors or books that you felt that you were taking inspiration from?
I'm glad you brought that up because that was the other appealing thing about Lowell was being in Massachusetts, not too far away from Salem. It just brought all this like kind of natural association with witches and witchcraft. I love fantasy that's very folklore based. So authors like just, Ireland, or P. Jelly Clark and what they're doing in the historical fantasy realm right now is so cool. Where they're taking American folklore and then they're weaving it into these historical fantasies. They're also really grappling with what does social justice mean within an American context. And then I also really love what Max Gladstone does in his craft sequence. He has a really interesting magical system that's largely based on debts and obligations and the idea of transferring value in this kind of supernatural way from one person to another, or from a person to a god, for example. When I first read the first one in his sequence, I thought, oh no, what Hannah's doing with the site is so similar to some of the things that he's describing. But he has different concerns than I do. So those are definitely there, percolating in my brain all the time. I also love historical fiction, just plain straight historical fiction. I'm going to blank on her name right now. Catherine Patterson, who wrote The Bridge to Terabithia, she has a really beautiful historical fiction novel for young readers about one of the mill girls called Liddy. And I read that and I found that really inspirational as well while I was writing this.
So hearing that the magical system in the book was one of the original components of the story for you is really interesting because I found the function that magic has and the way it's portrayed in this book to be really fascinating. Would you want to lay out a little bit about how magic works in this book? Because I certainly have questions about how it functions thematically, but just for anybody who has not read and is watching this, what is the magical system in the Factory Witches of Lowell?
It's largely based on the folkloric idea that our souls make connections with other physical objects. So in this story, for example, your hair has a connection with you on a spiritual level as well as a physical level. So what happens to the physical object affects what happens to you spiritually as well. And I took that and I took the labor theory of value and a lot of Karl Marx, and put those together. So not only do you have a physical connection with the pieces of you, the physical pieces of you, but you have a spiritual connection with the things that you make and the tools that you use. And then I thought about how would a capitalist use those latent connections for their aims, which is to make money. And then how would a working class person with class consciousness use those latent connections to strengthen themselves and their coworkers? So I have those two sides to the magic in the story.
There are these, I don't know if you would call them sort of opposing poles or opposing kind of valences of magic in the book, but there's the kind of magic that the factory girls use to sort of bind themselves together in the union, and that's painted very much as this sort of subaltern kind of oral tradition being passed around among these women. There's no like grimoire or magical text that they get it from. There's no wizard school that they go to learn it. It's referred to as kitchen magic at one point, and in the same way that skills of any other sort are passed between people who don't have access to the institutions of education or at the time printing, um, they are taught among these women. And then there's what I think is called papercraft at one point in the book, which is kind of like contract law, the idea of ownership within a capitalist system, and that also has some magical value. At one point, the girls can't cast a spell on the looms because they don't have legal ownership over them.
Right.
So that contrast is obviously talking about some historical and political themes. Did you think that did magic in this book or the tropes of the fantastic allow you to think through those themes in a way that maybe doing a more straight historical fiction novel wouldn't have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the big strengths of fantasy is that we can take things that you can only really describe in metaphor and make the metaphor literal. Um, so being able to write a spell that made the girls feel like they were really connected to each other and on the same side and had all this energy and we're just like vibing on each other. We're going on strike. Um, that let me describe a feeling that I think most people have when you're part of a team and the excitement of that kind of cooperation, but then literalize it into this spell that they have passed on themselves. Um, a lot of this comes from or was inspired by the work of Silvia Federici, who is an Italian historian who looks at the way that witch hunting was used to break up peasant resistance to the growth of capitalism, essentially, in Europe. And that people using, particularly women, using their kind of local knowledge or lore that had been passed down to strengthen their community, work together, live together in a communal way, was very threatening to this new order, which required people to no longer be peasants, get off the land, congregate in cities, start working in factories, get up at a certain time, have lunch at a certain time. And the way that witch hunts break out in Europe wherever there is resistance to this new regime. So I just really, that was part of the inspiration for the magical system as well. And it just laid it all out so beautifully that there's this magic that regular people sort of have. We can learn it, we can teach it to each other to create a community. And then there's some other kind of magic that sometimes gets imposed on us that short circuits that.
And that leads to a really fascinating moment in the book where the two leads are talking about basically attempting to perform magical sabotage on these looms. And one of them points out very forcefully that they are, by virtue of working in a textile mill that uses cotton picked in the slave owning South, they are imbricated in the system of enslavement that really that was the basis for America as a country, and that is portrayed in a way as a form of dark magic or a what you're talking about as form of ownership that is imposed. That was it's a really very striking moment. I was wondering if you how important was it to you that these girls acknowledge that?
I think incredibly important when you're writing a historical story that even though the cast may be all white because of the time and place that you're in, or largely white, that the world is not confined to those people. and you're acknowledging that the population is so much broader, and there's just so many other struggles happening. Um, as I was doing the research, I was really impressed by just how many of these real life mill workers became abolitionists, um, and recognized that the oppression that they were experiencing was, um, yes, enabled by the enslavement of kidnapped Africans, but that their suffering and the suffering of enslaved people was somehow linked, and that if they were going to stand up for themselves, they also needed to stand up for other people as well. And it's, I think, was also important in my conception of how ownership and asserting ownership um, was a capitalist manner of magic, of using magic. Um, that really crystallized for me. I read a history of slavery by Edward Baptiste, called "The Half Has Never Been Told," and he looks at slavery as the basis of American capitalism, um, and he also leans on these supernatural tropes and metaphors because there's almost no other way to describe it. How can you describe taking another human being and turning them into a piece of property, or a line in a balance book?
To jump, I mean, possibly to jump forward a little bit, but to remain in any of the years between now and then that you're interested in talking about, do you feel like this book is in conversation with any of the labor organizing that is going on now, or organizing for social justice that is going on anywhere now? I'm thinking of the strike portrayed in this book is led by women, as are so many of the most spectacular examples of labor actions over the past couple of decades. Be that hospital worker and care worker strikes, or the teacher strikes that have really rocked the country in the past decade or so. Were those on your mind, and were you thinking about this story's place in the modern conversation around labor? And
I don't really think there's much difference between what these characters are dealing with and what so many working class people are dealing with right now. Um, I mean, especially in the middle of a pandemic, when so many people are being told you have to be in this place that is bad for your health. And I mean, these girls are working in closed factories, breathing in cotton dust every day. Um, and I think I've been so inspired by, Amazon workers running out of their warehouse saying, no, we're not going to go to work in there right now. We know somebody has a case of COVID. It's not safe. Um, and I think we need more of that. I would love to see more stories in pulp culture about organizers, um, to normalize it, but also to uplift it, and say, this is kind of how to be a hero right now, where you are, because most of us have to go to a job every day. Um, and then a lot of just the interactions between these young women were based on things that either I have experienced, or friends who had experienced on the job, when they're trying to get their coworkers to take a stand about something. Because you always have the skeptic, you always have the kind of carefree person who's going to say, yeah, of course, let's go for it. But you're not sure if they're serious or not. So I kind of thought about those personalities and how they would interact, and a lot of those relationships and real life things just went into the story in the way that the girls talk to each other, and the camaraderie that they have, and also the conflicts that they have with one another.
so I know you already mentioned several of the influences for this book, but hearing you talk about the need for more stories about organizing in this way, are there any sources, just as a wrap up, are there any sources that you go to for these stories?
I think you should go to a source like American Prospect or Mother Jones or Democracy Now, where the news is really wants to cover these sorts of real life stories. And then if you're interested in it from the fictional side of things, I think you can go back to Emile Zola in France. You can go back to The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Mary Doria Russell has a book about that I haven't read yet about working class stories. So they're out there. John Sayles is another one. But like my editor said when he saw this manuscript, he said, "Gosh, I've never read a fantasy about a labor action," and and that's what sparked his interest in it. So I think unfortunately they're a little bit few and far between, but they're out there.